really am. I guess Mr. Heiss, who's running this, had some cancellations, and just last evening started to think about coming, and this morning I got up and my daughter and I decided to have a big adventure. I live about a 4-hour drive from here in Auburn, Alabama, which is of course home to the Mises Institute, which was, I must just indulge in a little tiny bit of history. The Mises Institute was of course founded by Lew Rockwell in the early 1980s. And for some of our libertarian friends who have a penchant for criticizing Mr. Rockwell, I'd just like to note he spent the early 2000s, the W era, not to mention the early 90s, the Bush Sr. era, decrying red state fascism, a phrase that Lew came up with, and of course was a vociferous opponent of the war in Iraq, even when a lot of libertarians were kind of saying, oh, you know, we have to have a realistic foreign policy. So Lew's been struggling with some back issues, so if anybody knows him or emails him, send him your wishes. So on the way down this morning, I was thinking a little bit about what I might say, and my own involvement with the LP is way, way, way in the past. I'm not a big believer in political action. I was involved in the California Libertarian Party in the early 1990s, and we ran a gentleman named Deist for governor, which was a very interesting experience, because back then, when you wanted to run for office, it was much, much, much more difficult to reach people. We spent a ton of money producing this cheap 30-second late night TV ad for Deist Thompson for governor, because it was on some obscure cable station, because that's what you did. It probably reached maybe 5,000 people at midnight or something. It cost a ton of money, took a bunch of time, whereas today, if Deist Thompson was still alive, he could run for governor and with the push of a button on Facebook reach 50 or 100,000 people. Things have really changed. And the digital revolution has really leveled the playing field. It's been a tremendous leveler. When some jerk off from the New York Times now publishes an article, guess what? In the comments section. And when Bill Kristol tweets something, you tweet back. And we should never forget what a sea change this is and what a great leveler it's been for libertarians. So, given that I don't really have any credibility in telling the LP what it ought to do or ought not to do, since I'm not involved, and I honestly am not a political person per se, I was just thinking out loud, what if you were starting from scratch and you wanted to create a libertarian party, small l, a libertarian political party, not capital L? And I think you really are starting from scratch. I mean, let's face it, Donald Trump came in out of nowhere and sucked all the oxygen out of the room. He kneecapped the Bush and Clinton crime families. And here we are. Okay? He spent half what Hillary spent. He had no ground game. I don't ever want to hear about campaign finance reform again. Okay? But there's lessons to be learned from Donald Trump, and I don't think the LP learned them very well in 2016. So if you were starting from scratch and creating a libertarian party, not to have libertarianism or to have party activities, but to actually advance liberty, well, the first thing you might do is not go after people who are liberty friendly, who just don't have an L in front of their name. They have an R in front of their name, like Thomas Massey. Out of all the 425 members of Congress, you might choose somebody like Nancy Pelosi to go after.
Yes.
Okay? In other words, you might be more interested in advancing small L liberty than big L Libertarian Party. But I think what you would do is you would take a look at things and you'd say, you know, we ought to talk about and think about and focus on three main things: war and peace, state power, and central banking. Okay? War and peace, state power, and central banking. Because first and foremost, if you're not talking about war and peace, if you're not significantly challenging the intervention of state in Washington, D.C., which is the biggest, most powerful, ugliest government in the history of the world, if you're not challenging that, you're never going to have small or limited or no government at home. End of story. War and peace. War and peace. If there's not if you're not running as an anti-war party, who needs you? We got two warrior parties already. Number two, state power. State power encompasses taxes and regulations. It considers drug war. It considers CIA and NSA snooping. It considers civil liberties. State power. Talk about state power. Don't talk about pot. Don't talk about gay marriage. Talk about state power as it affects those things. Number 3, central banking. We kid ourselves that we live in a capitalist economy. 1/2 of every transaction is basically controlled by a Politburo, a central planning board that decides how much dollars are worth and what it will cost to borrow them and how many we're going to produce next year. Okay, if we had a board charged with sitting around and deciding how many bushels of wheat we're going to produce next year, or how much auto workers should be paid to produce cars, the Wall Street Journal would be having conniptions and calling it Soviet-style central planning. That's exactly what we have with central banks. So when the Libertarian Party fails to make the Fed a front and center issue, I can only scratch my head. I said I could go a little longer. So that being said, 3 main issues. But how would you approach this issue? Well, you might take a look at what other popular people are doing. You might take a look at the success of the Ron Paul campaign in 2016. Ron Paul managed to put a populist spin on 2 very technical issues. One, central banking, which involves a lot of kind of circular reasoning and a lot of technical details about how the Fed actually does inflate the money supply. And then, of course, the long and sordid history of U.S. foreign policy, which most people are not particularly interested in. So what did he do? He boiled it down to 2 things. Get out of the Middle East. Okay? Everyone in America agrees with that. There is no constituency for continuing these Middle East wars outside of Washington, D.C. 0. Neither party. Number 2, end the Fed. He turned it into an easy, popular slogan. It doesn't matter that the average Joe or Jane doesn't understand technically how the Fed works. The average monetary economist, PhD, doesn't understand technically how the Federal Reserve works, okay? So we use populism. And you know what? He got 5,000 kids at Berkeley, 5,000 left-wing kids, and he got 5,000 kind of right-wing kids at Brigham Young with the exact same message. He doesn't tailor it for one or the other. He didn't pander. So what does Ron Paul receive for his efforts from the Libertarian Party? I don't know, I guess he had that R in front of his name, which is a purely tactical consideration by on Ron's part. Ron is as libertarian as anybody in this room, okay? So, who else might we look at? Bernie Sanders, okay? It turns out Ms. Am I saying this right? Ocasio-Perez, who won the primary, did I say that correctly? In Queens earlier this week. Well, it turns out a lot of people actually want a more undiluted message. And it turns out that most people don't like mealy-mouthed, same old, same old. So it might behoove a new Libertarian Party to say, well, let's not run a candidate who sounds like Jeb Bush or John Kasich. Why don't we run a candidate who sounds like a radical? Because here's the reality. The reality is that to win the U.S. presidency takes 70 million votes. 7-O-M, 70 million votes, okay? The second fly in the ointment is that we don't have a parliamentary system. We're not like the UK. We don't have a bunch of parties in Congress that can build single-issue coalitions and alliances that come and go for a particular bill or vote. We have this damnable 2-party system. So because of that, and because it takes 70 million people to win the presidency, you might focus on some other things. In other words, if you could go back in time in the 70s, start a new party, you might focus on being a state and local party. You might focus on being a spoiler party. Find out those races that are so tight where if the Libertarian can just get more than the difference, the delta between the 2 candidates, that you're a spoiler, then the 2 parties have to start listening to you, have to start paying attention. You might say, well, let's be the party of education. Let's rock and roll. Let's have some fun. Let's be Rothbardian. Let's be radical. Let's figure out a way to get on that debate stage and shake some people up, because you're not going to win 70 million votes. The other thing you might do is consider economics an absolute vital cornerstone of your program. You might say that proper economics is an absolutely vital part of any libertarian program. And of course, I'm a bit biased, but proper economics, in my view, is Austrian economics. You might say that people who don't have a real grounding in economics but consider themselves libertarians are kind of out there floating and they don't really have a grounding for things. And they can become susceptible to really dopey and dumb ideas. Ideas like rent is theft. Ideas like universal basic income. ideas like wage slavery, okay? So it doesn't make for the best libertarian when people lack economic knowledge. And we're not just talking about one tiny little sliver of libertarianism, because the rest of it's about drugs and other things. No, it is not a tiny little sliver of libertarianism. Reed Mises, he talked about economics as the stuff of life. It is literally about human action and what humans do. And what humans do, it turns out, is respond to incentives. So that's where the libertarian message can dovetail with economics and be very, very effective in presenting a results-oriented, action-oriented program. In other words, instead of esoteria, we're talking about here's why mechanically minimum wage actually increases unemployment amongst the least skilled folks in America. Here's why banning a green leaf that grows in the ground on the side of the road has all kinds of unintended consequences, like Mexican drug lords. In other words, you can make economics arguments that appeal far more to average people, to soccer moms, in a way that's more pragmatic and less scary to people. So as a result of all that, you might choose to not be hostile to the Mises Institute or the other libertarian organizations when you ran your party. You might choose to view them as allies, even, if you were creating this party from scratch. Bolden's a little sketchy. He talks about the Constitution. But you might choose to be friendly to somebody like Tom Woods, who's probably brought more people to the other than Ron. You might choose to treat Ron as kind of an emeritus figure in your movement and your party, and invite him to conventions. And I'll leave you with this. There are two huge sins in life, and they are huge sins in any political movement as well. One is hubris, and the other is ingratitude. Hubris is for our friends on the left and right. Hubris is for utopians. Hubris is for neoconservatives who think we can wade into the Middle East and turn the Khyber Pass in Afghanistan into some sort of a Jeffersonian Monticello. That's hubris. Hubris is for our friends on the left who think that we can somehow force everybody into a single-payer healthcare scheme and nothing will really change. Doctors will still be doctors. Really bright people will go to med school, and they won't mind that they make $100K instead of $500K because they just won't mind. Okay? That's hubris. Hubris is a sin, and it's a big sin in Libertarian Party politics, and we should never, ever, ever sound utopian or act like we know it all, because the reason we're libertarians is precisely because we don't know what's best for 320 million people. What's best 7 billion, 7.5 billion people? Libertarianism is about private solutions. Human beings muddle through. That's what they do. The utopias are for the Chinese communists. They're for the Bolsheviks. They're not for voters. Okay? Private solutions to daunting problems is the libertarian solution. Okay? It's because we don't know. If someone says, what should we do about health? We would say, that should be local and that should be you deciding. The second sin is ingratitude. Now, except for a few geniuses around us, very few of us are original thinkers. Very few of us will really add much to the libertarian canon or to the Austrian economics canon. And that's okay. Hayek had a term for this. He called it second-hand dealer as an idea. I'm very happy to be second-hand dealer in ideas. I'm very happy to act as support staff for intellectuals who are much better and smarter than me. A lot of them are dead, some of them are alive. That's my role, that's my job, is to promote them and their work. Okay? So other people did the hard work. They came up with the ideology, they came up with the theory, they came up with the books, they came up with the message. All we have to do is figure out how to sell it and promote it. Okay, we didn't have to design the product. We've already got a great product. And for anyone who thinks the product itself needs to evolve, let's not forget, again, we're not utopians. We don't believe in a third way. There's statism and there's liberty. Okay, there's no sort of third way. And technology, Bitcoin or otherwise, is not going to create a third way that doesn't. Any sort of third way thinking still requires force, which means it moves toward the statist end. So ingratitude is the program of thinking that you don't owe much to the great scholars, the great thinkers, the great men, the great women who have come before us, and sort of dismissing them and poo-pahing them and saying, oh, well, now that we have technology, you know, who cares about Rose Wilder Lane? Who cares about Ron Paul? Who cares about Murray Rothbard? Okay? There's a term for that. It's called ingratitude, and it is among the greatest of human sins, and I know nobody in this room will commit it. Thank you so much.